Before time, there was nothing. And then... As the universe expanded from an infinitesimal point, great beings from other dimensions seeped into our reality, fleeing an incomprehensible conflict known as the Great Celestial War. As gravity compressed hydrogen into higher elements around them, the great gods slept, curling up to heal. Around one, a small blue planet formed, and as a young species on its surface grew, the great Earth Dragon, as the godlike being would become known, started to stir. In the early 20th century, some men and women started to develop great powers beyond any other. With the advent of these superheroes, the world, once very much like our own, would never be the same again. These are the stories of the Mirage universe, and you're listening to the Mirage Barrage. You heard me. Kill Abner, Rashida's mother repeated. Rashida looked just like her mother, Khepri. She and her mother had been mistaken for sisters before, as Khepri looked quite young to most. But in Rashida's eyes, her face was lined and distinct, not purely from age, but from a harshness, a cruelty that sucked some of the suppleness from her cheeks. Rashida hadn't always hated her mother. She stood before her in her Egyptian palace. Khepri sat in her little throne atop a raised platform, Rashida at the bottom of the stairs. The bronze room was warmly lit, despite being cut off from the outside sun. Still, Rashida felt cold within these walls. "But Abner is your best lieutenant," she said, trying to appear calm. Proclaiming too vociferously the injustice of this situation would only enrage her mother. She had to appeal to her enlightened self-interest, as she called it. "Yes, quite, and that is why he must die," Khepri replied coolly. Rashida couldn't hide her shock. "Don't stand there slack-jawed. Didn't you learn anything at that school?" She meant the boarding school. It had been a cruel experience for Rashida. One need only glance at her to see that she was out of place. Rashida's grandmother had crowed about how they were descended from pharaohs, even from gods. But the time of the pharaohs was over. Now it was the time of other empires. Rashida's mother sensed the changes and was quick to latch on to the burgeoning British Commonwealth. She wanted her daughter to learn everything that they knew, so she sent her off. Except it wasn't quite that simple. Bribery and trickery were needed for the school to even consider Rashida. And admitting her was not accepting her. To most, she was an animal amongst the proper civilized white ladies. Her torment was unending, and it came from almost every direction, from nearly every person she met. Save one. One professor took pity on her, one woman who comforted her in her torment, one who did not judge, but instead asked about Rashida, asked about her and her life, how she came to be here. Rashida could not reveal her deepest secret, of course. Even before her mother had changed, she was insistent to Rashida to never reveal the truth. But she could tell Professor Lewis trivial things. Trivial things like how her mother had changed, though she couldn't speak of why. It was in telling her these things that Rashida realized how deeply she had been hurting. How lonely she had been. She wanted to tell Professor Lewis about what she could do to the other girls to make them understand a fraction of her pain. But Rashida was disciplined. She wouldn't do anything. Nothing overt, anyway. Lewis knew her too well, though, now. She could tell Rashida had taken some minor form of vengeance. Of course, she had no idea what that was. How could she? How could she know that Rashida, like her mother and grandmother and great-grandmother all the way back to the pharaohs, could weaken, could subdue, could sicken others with a touch? But Lewis was clever, brilliant, really. It was yet another reason Rashida admired her. She was teaching her more than any other teacher at the school, and she didn't waste her time with trivial things. But because she was so brilliant, she had long suspected something was deeply different about Rashida. She abruptly suggested they take a leave of the school one winter. Lewis pointed out that Rashida's mother would never know, and that there was more to be learned elsewhere. Rashida hated the school. She accepted at once. They traveled across Europe and met many strange people. Lewis, it seemed, had traveled much before, and had met many a strange individual from various far-off lands. Rashida's understanding of the world changed as each new voyager told her a little bit more about his home. But it was Lewis's dearest friend among these that most affected Rashida. He was a man from India, and most of their travels were in his company. He was hairy with a large beard and was soft-spoken, never angry. Rashida found it difficult to read through his calm, but his presence was as comforting as a sturdy pillar holding a roof above her head. She hardly needed Lewis's guidance to begin talking with the man. It came naturally and was quite easy. Soon she had told him everything that she had said to Lewis, except that instead of offering comfort, he merely nodded his understanding, interjecting only a word or two here or there. Rashida, wanting answers and tired of his silence at one point, demanded, "Well, what do you think?" The man answered slowly. He told her that he could see she was angry, and that was her greatest enemy. Rashida was outraged at that response. Clearly her greatest enemies were those who hurt her. The man explained. He absolutely agreed to the injustice of the situation. He told her that he believed that spiritually there was no division between people. What she was suffering was a mockery of the truth. But everyone had to walk a path. Being blinded by temptations like anger only led one further away from righteousness and from enlightenment. Rashida didn't understand everything he said, but when she asked questions, he explained. He explained that he was a Sikh, and how wrath was one of 5 thieves which were at odds with one's spirit, how your life was sacred, and how you could reconnect with God, in part through virtues like truth, compassion, contentment, humility, and love. Rashida didn't absorb it all, but it left her feeling different. While some of what he said was mysticism to her, much of it struck a chord within her. While Lewis had healed her, this man had inspired her. When she returned to her mother, she kept part of him within herself, and decided to try to reform her mother and her organization from within. She had found Abner on this path, and while he wasn't so confident, after many nights alone together, sharing their secrets, he too began to believe. "Why is it that by being the best he had earned a death sentence?" Rashida asked. "Silly girl, it is because he doesn't need me anymore," Khepri explained. "He is quite capable on his own, which means he has never been more dangerous. He has served me well, but need serve me no longer. We have replacements that won't be too quick to outgrow their leashes." Rashida was appalled. "How can you expect your men to follow you if they know the best of them will be slaughtered?" "Don't you remember how I warned Abner not to interfere with the Ophidians? But Abner has more than enough men and resources to easily deal with them. But I told him not to, so when he is killed dealing with them, the others will not think I am responsible, but instead will heed my words even more carefully than they do now." "So that's it then?" "Yes, what are you still doing here? You have work to do." "No." "Excuse me?" "I said no, Mother." "The impudence! I will have to teach you a lesson." Khepri rose from her throne. "Hear this," Rashida proclaimed before her mother could start. "This may be the last conversation we have. I remember when you were kind, when you taught me to be better, when you actually loved me. In honor of that, I ask that you hear me out. I admit it. I've been working against you this entire time, because what you do is wrong, and you know it. You cheat, steal, and murder purely for your own gain, and no justification about our bloodline makes that right. Listen to me, and we can undo this. But if you don't, we both know it'll be over in a single touch." Khepri contemplated Rashida a moment, but the daughter understood all too well what the mother was thinking. She was not considering her words. She was appraising where to strike. How she could most quickly lay her hands on Rashida's skin to begin the same corruption that her mother had passed to her. It wouldn't work. Rashida knew how to end the cycle. For with their great powers, they also had one great weakness. Khepri launched herself at Rashida, but it was clumsy. The Sikh had also taught Rashida something about fighting, something to be used only when necessary. Now was such a time. It was defeat her mother or be overwhelmed by a thief that would steal her soul, a thief greater than the man had known about. Rashida stepped out of the way of her mother's grasp and jabbed her fist into a spot just above her mother's stomach. Rashida put her full, considerable, inhuman force into the blow. Her mother gasped in shock, stumbled, then collapsed to the floor. Her rasping breath told Rashida she had succeeded. Khepri knew she was dying. She held up a weak hand from her prone position on the floor.
"You did it,"
she wheezed, her strength failing fast. Her face struggled between sadness and disbelief.
"You are the heiress to Sekhmet now. It is yours to do with as you please. I have no right to ask. But please, grant me this mercy. Let me be near my daughter as I die."
Rashida lowered herself to her knees, but did not approach. Tears streaked her face.
"I am sorry, Mother. But if you had truly loved me, you would be asking for this sooner. Now your words are tainted. It's not me you want, but your chance at immortality."
Khepri's face flushed with anger, but that only betrayed the truth of Rashida's statement. A desperate anger filled Khepri, but it was not enough to reinvigorate her body. It was only in the final moments that her face turned to an expression of acceptance. The closest thing Rashida had seen on it to peace in years. Tears streamed down her face as she cried, but eventually she raised her head once more in determination. Sekhmet Scion, Rashida Queen, raised her head to address the Alien Council, the Galactic Concordance dedicated to keeping the peace amongst the stars. The 9 representatives from the 9 species made up this most powerful body, but the Concordance had done nothing when the usurper brought his armies to Earth. "Earth accepts your invitation into the Alliance," she said. Rashida was in her superhero costume now. While it would probably be impolitic to wear it in a meeting of Earth governments, it hardly stuck out compared to the strange garments of the aliens. A vibrantly violet custom breastplate designed to shield her weak spot was laid over a white top, with a further armored piece extending down to her teal skirt. Bracers on her forearms, as well as her boots, were colored deep red, almost hinting at a purplish hue, and were finished with slight plated fins along the edges, designed to get through armor so that her mystical touch could take effect on her enemies. The alien ambassadors nodded at her statement. "Conditionally," Rashida added. That cut the nods short. The Sifa representative, a creature that looked something like a bipedal seal, but a bit more rabbit-like in the face and with legs like a bird's, squeaked out,
"What do you mean, conditionally?"
He, along with the other representatives, were seated behind a curved table. The banners of the 9 species nations hung behind them. The table was some sort of marble, and the black walls were lined with exotic but deeply colored somber wood. Across the room was the marble podium where Rashida addressed the council. She looked at the Sifa representative, then at the other council members. "When Earth asked for your assistance, we remember your answer. You were right that our planet is divided, in more ways than one. You were right that we are not as advanced as you. But when you denied aid, you were wrong. You were unjustified. Earth fought its battle alone, and let it be known that Earth won. We may be small compared to many of your worlds, but let it be known that we are not weak. We fought off an invasion that rightfully made you tremble, and we will take a seat on this council, but as equals as we have earned." Some of the ambassadors started to protest, but Rashida didn't let them finish. "I accept the wisdom of many of your policies, that introducing much of your technology to our world would be disastrous, that we are not yet socially or culturally ready for such things. On many of these issues, we defer to you. But on the metal moon, that belongs to us. That will be the first step in our new planetary defenses. We appreciate the aid offered to us in creating a modern spacefaring defense force, but such a force will be ours. Not a protectorate ran by this council, a true Earth force."
"You are demanding we grant you special privileges with no oversight,"
a 3-eyed green Xenoth protested. "I'm only asking for the help you should have given in the first place," Rashida countered. "If you want us on your council, we're here to join. But those are our terms. If you don't like them, fine. We've already proven that we can get along without you. Earth is now a player on the galactic stage, and we're not going anywhere. How our relationship develops is now up to you. Sekhmet Scion plopped the datapad with the proposal onto the table in front of the ambassadors and then walked off. You sure this'll work? Orson Fiennes, head Crystal Crusader on Earth, asked. No, Rashida answered honestly, but I wasn't lying. We can handle ourselves. And if we can't, we need to learn. But either way, no one is served by surrendering to their whims. The Concordance capitulated, agreeing to lend their expertise to help build Earth Force. Orson Fiennes strolled down the corridor of the flagship. It might not live up to the star cruisers of the Garson, Elgra, or Alquenidae, but it was the glory of Earth, or it would be once it was finished. Orson was overseeing the cooperation of the Earth workers and military trainees with the alien advisors. The humans were taking to their tasks with relish. Many of them were the best in their fields, and even those that weren't were shocking Orson with how quickly they were adapting to the alien technology. As he strolled through the starship, he was impossible to miss. If he didn't stick out because of his size, his pristine white uniform, which was lined with bright yellow, his bright light blue gloves and boots, and his hexagonal shield embellished with the stylized CC of the Earth Crystal Crusaders would do the trick. The lead Crystal Crusader walked into the reactor room. The round room was dominated by a volcano-shaped machine rising from the floor, and its mirror image descending from the ceiling. In the space between them, a cylinder of glowing energy connected the two. The reactor was surrounded by handrails and barriers, and on occasion an instrument panel. More controls and instrumentation could be found along the perimeter of the room. "How's the Fatal Harmony doing?" Orson asked the chief engineer. "Crystal Crusader," he said, surprised. "Didn't realize you were doing the rounds." "I want everything to be running perfectly," Orson replied. "We're just about to change orbit. This antimatter reactor is really something else. Even with just the small quantities we're working with, it's putting out a tremendous amount of energy." "Huh. That's weird." "What is?" The chief engineer looked closer at his monitor. "Looks like a computer malfunction. Probably just a glitch." "What's it say?" "A strange reading on the inertial dampeners." Orson Fiennes closed his eyes. The Crystal Crusaders never went anywhere without backup, and Orson was never alone. "I'm on it," his partner said in his mind. Orson Fiennes' left eye was a fake, a glowing blue replacement for the one he lost. Now it dimmed, the glow leaving the crystal orb. A bright blue flicker of energy beamed out of it, twisted around, and flew through the walls of the ship. A moment later, in the being of energy, Orson's partner that dwelled within his crystal flew back into him and reported back. "We're off course, drifting slightly towards the planet." This time the engineer could hear the being's voice as well. He immediately started flicking through screens on his monitor. "None of the sensors show us off course," he said. "That would mean—" Fiennes was way ahead of him. He sent off his crystal spirit into the engines of the ship. There it merged with the machinery, becoming one with the ship's central propulsion. With this fusion, it carefully, manually adjusted the engines and started to right the falling ship. Meanwhile, his human partner was scanning the room, taking note of the other engineers around. One was looking particularly nervous. The scrawny bespectacled man tried to casually walk from one station to another. Orson approached at a natural pace so as not to startle the suspect. He glanced up at Orson, and seeing him approach, the engineer panicked. Orson tossed away subtlety and ran towards the man. He grabbed him and dragged him away from his control panel. Glancing back at it, Orson's jaw tightened. "Time to get out of here," he said. The chief glanced at his display, then back up and nodded grimly. The traitor engineer had sabotaged the reactor. It was going to blow. A Marine grabbed the bespectacled engineer as everyone evacuated, and sirens blared throughout the ship. Orson stood firm as the chief ran past him. "Crusader, it's about to blow! We gotta run!" "Go on ahead. I'm not done here yet," he replied. The crystal spirit returned once more. "I've got things back on a level, but it looks like you've made a mess of things." "This reactor is going to blow. How?" The spirit leapt out, fused with one of the instrument panels for a second, and then returned. "See those pipes running along the ceiling and the walls?" "Got 'em," Orson confirmed, seeing them stretch across the top of the room like thin veins.
They've been jammed open so that they are sending too much antimatter to the core. We have enough reactant mass that we won't blow up right away, but once that runs out, the antimatter will start hitting the equipment. And when that happens,
we blow up. Got it. Can we eject the core?
Not without a premature explosion. The problem is the antimatter will keep coming.
Don't we have any safety measures?
Plenty, all sabotaged. But the big one is lifting the reactor room to the outer hull and then ejecting the core, which, like I said, not gonna work.
Wait, this room moves?
Yes, it makes maintenance and loading the antimatter fuel pod much safer, but I don't see how.
Make it happen.
Orson stepped over the rails and closer to the core. He carefully examined the machinery as the room began to rise, making its way towards the outer skin of the spacecraft. The crystal spirit returned. I have a bad feeling that I know exactly what's going through your head.
Well, you've lived there long enough. Will it work?
It might. It's more of what happens after that worries me.
That's what I have you for. Now let's do this.
Crystal Crusader raised his hexagonal shield above his head, carefully angled it until it was just right, and then concentrated. He and his crystal spirit attuned themselves to each other, and the energy burst out. A light blue lattice of energy, hexagons extending like a beehive, flew outwards from the shield. It extended through the walls of the room and in the blink of the eye cut through them. Almost at once, the antimatter spilled out from the severed pipes. The energy shield, created by the power of the crystal spirit, held firm and didn't react with the volatile material, but the rest of the ship wasn't so lucky. Freed from the specialized tubing that kept it from reacting with the rest of the ship, the antimatter soon touched oxygen, and for some lucky particles, the metal of the ship. In a brilliant flash, everything above the shield vanished. The atmosphere in the reactor room held for a second or two after the explosion. Then, the force of the contained air pulled the Crystal Crusader from his perch and launched him into space. But even before he could panic, a new lattice of energy, this time in the shape of a bubble, formed around him. He could still breathe. Floating through space, he could see the reactor room extended to the outside of the fatal harmony. It was sliced neatly off, a perfectly straight line cutting through it. "What do you think?" the crystal spirit asked. "Are we going to get credit for saving the ship, or blame for cutting apart the reactor on Earth's finest spacecraft?"
Orson grimaced. "You have a coin?"
Agent Ozzel sat across from the American representative. He was a high-ranking official in the Calvian government, working closely with the High Mentor, the powerful dictator of the nation, granted a myriad of marvelous powers which he used to rule and lead his people. The two were sitting in an indoor courtyard, overlooked on all sides by several floors of the complex. It was simple and modern, with very few distractions, but plenty of amenities for the traveling businessman or official. Hotels, restaurants, cafes, and more were all found within the complex. Its semi-translucent white dome meant they could also enjoy some of the natural light without being subject to the nastier elements of Mother Nature. The American was fishing, and Ozzel knew it. But this would work in his favor. "In the oil fields. Can we assume you will have no objections to the renegotiations of the contracts?" the representative asked. "No, of course not," Ozzel replied with a toothy smile. "But if you don't mind me saying, I do not think this is why you have come to speak with me today, Mr.
Jameson.
Mr. Jameson.
I am afraid you are correct, Mr. Ozzel. We've had some concerns with certain recent incursions."
"Incursions? You mean the affair with Kirby Cole?" Ozzel asked. Jameson was stunned. As Ozzel expected, the American was stunned that he would just come out and say it. It would of course be suicidal to admit such a thing. If he had said this to anyone else but a dead man, it certainly would have been. The gunshot sounded just as Ozzel expected, flying straight and true, right at Jameson's head. Ozzel blinked. Jameson was still there. His eyes refocused, and he saw a slight disturbance in the air, and amidst it, there was the bullet, hanging inches in front of Jameson's face. Ozzel's jaw dropped as the face suddenly melted away. Jameson's face twisted away into a translucent red one, the face of the Psychurge. The superhero was now fully into his red crystalline form. The suit shape-shifted away into his body as well. All he was missing was his silvery mask, gauntlets, and boots, and of course, his green cape.
No sooner had Ozzel processed that than a green bundle flew up to Sykerge, who caught it, unwrapped it, and revealed a large silver band which could fit neatly around his head, covering his eyes and ears. As Sykerge caught his cape, the bullet fell neatly onto the table between the two men, and Ozzel saw a figure sprint off. The figure was No Man, clad in gray-white mask and yellow robes. Suddenly he understood. No Man could create fields from his hands which cancelled out all momentum within them. One of these fields had stopped the bullet from hitting its mark. Now, No Man was running towards the location of the sniper. But No Man was on the ground floor like Ozzel and Sykerge. The sniper was on the third. No Man wouldn't be able to reach him before. No Man reached the wall, leapt upwards, and touched his hand to the wall. It stuck there, and then No Man pulled himself up, reached out with his other arm, and that hand too stuck to the wall. He began climbing, straight up the flush surface. Ozzel couldn't comprehend it. No Man didn't have a climbing power. As Sykerge grabbed a hold of him, he slowly figured out how it could have happened. No Man's field stopped momentum relative to the position of his hands. They, as well as whatever entered the field, stopped moving. So if No Man extended that field to something already still, something that would support his weight, his hand would essentially be stuck to it. Sykerge was once more wearing his cape and mask, and was now looking into Ozzel's eyes. Ozzel trembled. He hadn't counted on meeting opposite a super, and especially not this one in particular. Sykerge could read minds. Now, entering someone's mind is a rather grave violation of someone's privacy and their deepest rights. One could very easily abuse someone with such a power, and those with it were held to a very high standard. Because of that, Sykerge had his mask specially constructed. A small node that sat above his eyes, like a bump on his forehead, magically filtered out the information he dredged from others' minds. He would be conscious of the information in Ozzel's head only as long as he was first reading the mind. When he found the information he was justified in retrieving, the mask would then erase all knowledge of Ozzel's other thoughts from the Sykerge's mind. Thus, the mask was a great psychic filter. Ozzel slumped unconscious by the time No Man returned. "What happened?" he asked. "Are we safe?" Sykerge interjected first. "The sniper is subdued and secured. He's not going anywhere. Calvia has become more aggressive than even you thought." "No, this was not Calvia. Only Ozzel and some other group." "Other group?" "I could not find anything more specific. It's strange. He had some sort of block. I've encountered others who could block my powers, but none that felt as strange as him." "And it was blocking the name of the group he worked for?" "Yes. I don't know who else is involved, and I couldn't find any other leads. But I'm sure of one thing. Whatever it is big, and it reaches across the globe." Air Force One flew gracefully through the sky. Within, Rebecca Saunders, assistant to the president, prepared a handful of documents to present to the commander-in-chief. He should have had this meeting already, but the discussions with the secretary went far beyond schedule. Now he would have little time for the most important part of the day, catching up with the Earth's representative on the relations with the Galactic Concordance. As she finished scooping up the summaries of the deep space meetings, the plane suddenly rocked. Miss Saunders quickly grabbed the wall to steady herself when the explosion rocked the plane. A sudden rush of air filled the cabin with a horrible howl. As the plane felt like it was turning onto its side, Miss Saunders lost her balance and hit the floor hard. The papers were ripped from her arms and suddenly spiraled out of the plane, along with a cloud of flying debris. Miss Saunders struggled to catch her breath as she looked up at the breach when another ball of flame suddenly ripped through the wall. When she finally lowered her arms from her face, she saw two horrible things. First, her arms were charred and burnt, and second, standing in the rushing wind, framed by the hole in the plane, was a mechanical man with thin purple slits for eyes.
"Hello, darling."
The robot's voice cut through the rushing wind with startling authority.
"I'm looking for the president. You mind showing me the way?"
He loaded the 4-barreled rocket launcher he was holding menacingly as his eyes glared down at her. Suddenly, 3 Secret Service agents appeared out of nowhere. Even as their hair and ties were whipped around by the wind, their faces were unmoved and their guns were trained steadily on the intruder. After a half second of evaluating the situation, they opened fire at the robot.
Must we go through with this dance, silly men?
The robot asked with exasperation. He lazily raised his weapon towards the agents, unfazed by the ricocheting bullets. Just as his weapon became level, a blur smashed into his chassis, and he was flung into the blue sky beyond. "Thanks for the decoy," the woman who had just impacted the android shouted back towards the Secret Service agents. They nodded stiffly back at her, and it was then that Miss Saunders realized who the woman was. As the representative of Earth to the Galactic Concordance leaned down and touched Miss Saunders' burned arms, she felt a warm, liquid sensation soothe her injuries. Within a few seconds, her arms were as unmarred as ever, and Rashida Queen stood back up. Dressed in her suit for the meeting with the President, she hardly looked like the hero Sekhmet Scion, except for her wig, which was always the same distinctive short black smooth hair. "Get the plane down safely. I'll handle our guest," she shouted back over her shoulder, and before anyone could react, she leapt out of the hole in the plane. Her aim was perfect. Just as the android was regaining stable flight and adjusting his feet thrusters to once more reach the breach, Sekhmet Scion flew out and landed on the metal man. Startled by the sudden impact, the robot struggled to determine what was happening. In a second of confusion, Sekhmet wrapped her legs around the machine's waist and got a steady grip.
"Ah, Sekhmet Scion,"
the robot said as it restabilized and got a view of his attacker. One of his large metal claws suddenly grabbed Sekhmet's right hand and began to squeeze with several tons of force.
"According to my database, you lack the ability to fly, and your bioelectrical attacks are useless against my frame. An admirable, but poor choice, I'm afraid."
His claw increased the pressure, and Sekhmet's face twisted up with pain, but she didn't release the android as the two soared through the air. "The matchup isn't ideal," she conceded, "but I don't cower in fear from odds alone." Her left hand suddenly jabbed into the robot's shoulder joint. The flesh and bone pierced the metal as if they were a blade of plasma, easily ripping into the delicate ball joint.
"What?"
The machine screeched in apparent pain. Before he could utter another word, Sekhmet Scion grabbed onto the internal shoulder mechanics and tore outwards, ripping off the machine's arm, and the rocket launcher with it. The limb twisted in the air and quickly vanished from view. The android recovered fast and returned its gaze to the hero who had caused the damage.
"Fair play. I must abort my mission, but at least I can have the satisfaction of paying you back."
Suddenly, the arm clutching onto Sekhmet Scion reeled back and tossed Rashida straight downwards, towards the earth thousands of feet below. A moment of panic flitted through Rashida's head as she saw the small dot of the robot fly off, and the larger shadow of Air Force One shrink too. The robot had been right. She didn't have the ability to fly, but she had taken that into account when she leapt out of a flying plane. Rashida twisted around and spread her limbs so that she was facing the distant ground. The drag from her arms and legs would slow her some, but would never be enough for a safe landing. Not a safe landing for a human, anyway. But Rashida had been born from 4,000 years of powerful women who each passed on a greater degree of power to their daughter, and she had worked to bring this power to even grander heights. She carefully adjusted her descent, making sure she kept her forward momentum. As the ground rushed up to meet her, she prepared for the roll and to protect her head. 20 minutes later, when the army personnel arrived at the crash site to see if she had survived, they found Rashida Queen with a very torn-up suit, but otherwise without a scratch. "You've got to be kidding me," one of the soldiers said, staring at her as she walked calmly towards the helicopter. "You survived a fall from 45,000 feet without even a broken bone?" "Oh no," Rashida corrected quickly, surprised the soldier thought that was the case. "I broke both legs in several places, several ribs, one arm, punctured several organs, and probably did something really nasty to my back." The soldier blinked. "What? But how?" Rashida smiled softly and shrugged modestly. "I got better," she replied simply. As she rode back on the chopper with the other soldiers, she made sure not to add to the cajoling the soldier received for not knowing about Sekhmet Scion's incredible healing abilities. "And another 2 attacks makes 5 major incidents targeting the United States or its allies," Renaissance Man said to Dauntless Dynamo. Renaissance Man's costume was less bold than Dynamo's, looking much like period dress, covered by a long, deep blue cloak finished with similarly colored flat cap and a green face mask and scarf, the latter of which covered the rest of his face. While matching the theme of his codename, the costume was actually much more sophisticated than it appeared, concealing body armor and several pouches of weapons and tools. Dynamo had his usual red and white armor, accentuated with dark gold stripes, though he wasn't wearing his aerodynamic helmet. These definitely aren't coincidence. While they all involve apparently independent actors of completely different backgrounds, this level of activity is so improbable that you'd have better luck cleaning out all the casinos in Vegas than seeing this happen naturally. The two walked into the main conference room of the Stormbreakers HQ. The headquarters was an artificial island in the North Atlantic, dominated by a round complex in the middle. At the top of this complex was the round conference room, with windows making up 3/4 of the walls, giving a clear view to the crystal blue waters all around. There was a circular table with chairs all around and a holographic projector in the center. Renaissance Man and Dauntless Dynamo took their seats around the table, joining the others. While there was no head of the table, Sekhmet Scion was in the spot typically belonging to the leader, until recently Captain Cosmos. Crystal Crusader, No Man, and Psychurge were there, as was the final member of the current Stormbreakers, Kid Cosmos. He wore a deep red jumpsuit with a scout-style blue short-sleeved uniform over top tucked into his utility belt. The neckerchief was grossly oversized, flapping down his back like a stunted cape. His slightly long blonde hair poked out from under his baseball cap with the Cosmos logo, and he had a matching bat on his belt, hung like a sheathed sword. His odd fashion sense emphasized why he still called himself Kid, even when he was in his mid-20s. Or what would have been mid-20s for a human. "Late again, Diego," Jeremy, Kid Cosmos, said. "I'm officially taking away your speedster title." "Kid, I'd officially take away your style points, but you never had any to begin with," Dynamo countered. "All right, settle down and let's get started," Sekhmet Scion said gently. "We all know the situation. Someone is causing severe havoc through a bunch of proxies. Since we don't know who's behind it, let's start from the top and review what we know about these agents." Diego piped up, having expert knowledge of most of the world's villains. The big hitter from the group was Prime Arsenal, the robot that attacked Air Force One. Early experiment with AI technology smuggled from the 301, that's the three-armed alien robot guys. Needless to say, it was a terrible idea. The people making Prime Arsenal didn't really know what they were doing, and he gained sapience. While he's extremely dangerous, he doesn't work for anyone, and mostly keeps to himself, except when he feels like wreaking havoc. Complete mystery as to who he could be working for. Same goes for Piston Whipper, an amalgamation of muscle and car parts. He's usually just a low-level crook. Ditto for Merc. As for the two humans involved, the engineer Thomas Cook had a sterling record up until this point, even serving with distinction during the Battle of Armageddon. Calvia's Agent Ozzel is a trickier matter. He had a lot of leeway and access to pretty much whoever he wanted. It's rare for a Calvian official of his rank not to be absolutely loyal to the High Mentor, but if he found someone who convinced him that this was a good idea... "Are we sure Calvia itself isn't responsible?" Crystal Crusader interrupted. "They were just responsible for the Giant attack. Maybe they're scaling things up." "It doesn't feel right," Renaissance Man answers. "Paying off some career thugs and even being able to offer Prime Arsenal something is certainly within their means. But the corruption of a promising soldier, one who shined bright enough to get a spot on Earth Force, they need something more substantial to get him to turn." "He's right," Kid Cosmos chimed in. "I talked to a few of those guys, and they weed out anyone who isn't absolutely committed to Earth defense. All of Earth. The fleet is international, and you can bet everyone, east or west, is vetting those holding the guns and reactors in the ultimate high ground." "Renaissance Man is incorrect," No Man piped up. "Renaissance Man is incorrect," No Man piped up. "We are not looking for something more substantial. No substance is likely to have changed the mind of such a man. We are looking for something or someone who could have attracted this Thomas Cook to something far more insubstantial." "You mean spiritual," Psychurge guessed. "Or perhaps ideological. Cook was persuaded into believing his actions were necessary." "If so, he hasn't said anything about it," Crusader muttered. "He's kept absolutely silent about the whole affair. It's making the Pentagon real antsy." He didn't turn commie, did he? Kid Cosmos asked. A touch of seriousness crossed his face for the first time.
Wouldn't the explosion of the Fatal Harmony have affected the entire planet, east or west? Scion interjected.
Crusader tapped a few buttons at the table. The holoprojector sprang to life, showing the Earth and the Fatal Harmony orbiting above. If it had detonated, Crusader explained, advancing the simulation, showing pieces of the ship raining down onto the planet, it would have mostly hit North America. But that was Cook's plan B. He first tried to change the ship's course. Problem is, because we stopped him just as he started his little maneuver, we don't really know what he was going to do with it.
So he might have been targeting North America, or he might have been targeting the planet itself, Scion asked.
Orson shrugged. Back up, Dynamo said. We agree that he was vetted thoroughly before joining Earth Force. Then we know he must have converted or whatever after that. Earth Force hasn't existed long. Let's just pull up his records and ask around to see if he's met up with any strange people. I'll get started, Renaissance Man said, just a touch eager. A red notice flashed on the holographic display. The team looked to Sekhmet Scion, the only one at the right angle to read it properly. She grimaced.
Gentlemen, it appears Jeremy may have been correct. We've just received word of a Mediterranean island, one equipped with an ICBM, just falling into hostile hands. Early reports indicate Russian forces.
An ICBM? Renaissance Man emphasized.
That's right,
Scion confirmed. They all knew what that meant. Momentarily forgotten about due to the Battle of Armageddon and the formation of the Earth Force, the impending threat of nuclear annihilation once more raised its ugly head. If the missile launched, everything would be over. Diego had already zipped out of the room and zipped back. Plane's ready for emergency takeoff, he said. Scion nodded.
Stormbreakers, move out.
Will the Stormbreakers be able to avert catastrophe? Is this the beginning of a new world war? And is this conspiracy too much for even these heroes to handle? This and more, next time on the Mirage Barrage.